Imagine you're dropped naked into a forest at midnight with no tools, no clothes, no fire, and no idea how to make any of them. Your teeth are dull, your nails are useless against bark, your skin is thin, and your only advantage is a brain that is currently screaming in panic. How long would you last? A week, maybe if you were lucky and find stream. But for millions of years, this was the reality of your ancestors. They had no fire to cook meat, no fire to scare away predators, no fire to survive the cold of an ice age. And yet, they did not just survive. They thrived. They spread across continents, outlasted massive beasts, and laid the foundation for everything you call civilization. So, how did ancient humans survive without fire? The answer is going to completely shatter your image of prehistoric life. You probably think of early humans as shivering, starving wretches huddled in caves, waiting for lightning to strike so they could finally cook a meal. But the truth is far more brutal, far more ingenious, and far more alien than anything you have imagined. Before we dive into the science, let us pause for a moment. If you enjoy exploring the hidden depths of human evolution, then you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell right now. Because on this channel, we do not just tell you what happened, we show you how it felt to be there. Now back to the fire, or rather, back to the world without it. For the first 2 million years of the genus Homo, fire was a rare, terrifying, and uncontrollable force of nature. Think about that. Your ancestors lived in a world where the only warmth came from the sun, the only light came from the moon and stars, and the only cooked food was what happened to be caught in a wildfire. And yet, their bodies and brains were already changing in ways that would eventually make fire essential. There is a massive misconception that humans are weak. You are not. You are a persistence hunter, a distance runner, a fat-storing, sweat-cooling, tool-using machine. But even with all that, the cold is a killer. Without fire, how did these early humans, with their relatively hairless bodies, survive nights that dropped below freezing? The answer lies in something you still do today: huddling. But not just any huddling. Your ancestors mastered the art of communal thermoregulation. They slept in groups, sometimes dozens of individuals, pressed together in shallow pits lined with grass, leaves, and animal hides. This is not speculation. Archaeologists have found these sleeping hollows, called hearthless sleeping structures, dating back over 1 million years. The science is simple. A single human generates about 100 watts of heat at rest. Put 10 humans together, and you have a living, breathing 1 kilowatt radiator. But they did not just rely on body heat. They also used a technique called microclimate management. They would dig a shallow trench, line it with dry vegetation, and then cover themselves with more vegetation and hides. This trapped a layer of warm air against their skin, much like a modern sleeping bag. Experiments with modern hunter-gatherers have shown that such a structure can raise the temperature inside by up to 10 degrees Celsius, even in freezing conditions. So, no fire did not mean freezing to death. It meant getting very, very close to your family. Now, what about food? This is the big one. Everyone says that cooking was the key to human evolution. Cooked food is easier to digest, provides more calories, and allowed our brains to grow. But if you have no fire, you cannot cook. So, how did early humans get enough energy to fuel those growing brains? The answer is raw meat, but not the kind you buy at the supermarket. Your ancestors were eating meat that was essentially predigested. They were scavengers long before they were hunters. They would follow packs of hyenas, lions, and saber-toothed cats, waiting for them to finish their kill. Then they would move in and crack open the bones with rocks to get the marrow. Marrow is pure fat, a dense energy source that requires no cooking. But they also ate the raw muscle meat. Here is the thing: raw meat is not as dangerous for a healthy human as you think. Modern humans can eat raw meat as long as it is fresh. The problem is bacteria. But early humans did not store meat for days. They ate it immediately, often within hours of the kill. And their guts were different. They had a much larger appendix and a longer colon, which allowed them to ferment plant fibers and break down tough proteins. They also had a higher stomach acidity than you do, strong enough to kill most pathogens. So, raw meat was not a death sentence. It was a survival strategy. But there is another, more disturbing source of calories: cannibalism. Archaeological evidence from sites like Grandolina in Spain, dating back 800,000 years, shows clear signs of butchery on human bones. The cuts are identical to those on animal bones. This was not ritualistic, it was nutritional. When food was scarce, your ancestors ate each other. It was a brutal, pragmatic solution to a life-or-death problem. And without fire, they ate that flesh raw. Now let us talk about teeth. Without fire to soften food, your ancestors had to have incredibly strong jaws. And they did. Early Homo erectus had teeth that were massive, with thick enamel and deep roots. They could crush nuts, seeds, and raw roots that would break your modern teeth. But they also used tools to process food before eating it. They used hammerstones to crack open nuts and bones. They used sharp flakes of stone to slice meat into smaller, more manageable pieces. This is called external digestion. By breaking food down outside the body, they reduced the work their teeth and stomachs had to do. This is a key evolutionary step. The more they used tools to process food, the less they needed massive jaws. And over time, their jaws got smaller, their teeth got smaller, and their brains got bigger. It is a feedback loop. But here is the paradox. Smaller jaws meant weaker bites. And weaker bites meant they became even more dependent on tools. Without fire, they perfected the art of raw food engineering. They would soak tough roots in water for hours to soften them. They would pound meat into a paste to make it easier to swallow. They would ferment grains and seeds in animal stomachs, creating a primitive form of sourdough. Modern hunter-gatherers, like the Hadza of Tanzania, still practice these techniques. They eat raw honey, raw meat, and raw tubers, and they are incredibly healthy. So, no fire did not mean a poor diet. It meant a different diet, one that required constant work and innovation. Now, let us address the elephant in the cave: predators. Without fire, how did you defend yourself from a pack of hyenas, a cave lion, or a giant bear? The answer is terrifying. You did not defend. You avoided. Early humans were not apex predators. They were prey. They lived in constant fear of being eaten. But they had three advantages: numbers, noise, and intelligence. When a predator approached, a group of humans would scream, throw rocks, and wave branches. They would act like a single, chaotic, unpredictable organism. This is called mobbing behavior, and you see it in modern chimpanzees and baboons. It works because predators are risk-averse. A lion will not attack a group of screaming, stone-throwing creatures if it can find an easier meal. But this only worked during the day. At night, things got much worse. Without fire, the night was absolute darkness. And in that darkness, predators ruled. So, early humans had to find safe sleeping sites. They slept in caves with narrow entrances, on cliff ledges, or in trees. Yes, your ancestors slept in trees, like chimpanzees, but they were not good at climbing. Their bodies were adapted for walking, not climbing. So, they built sleeping platforms. Archaeologists have found evidence of simple sleeping platforms, made of branches and leaves, dating back over 500,000 years. These platforms were flimsy by modern standards, but they were enough to keep you out of reach of a prowling hyena. But what about the cold? We already covered huddling, but there is another trick. They used animal carcasses. If a group killed a large animal, like a mammoth, they would sleep inside the carcass. Yes, they would crawl into the rib cage of a dead elephant, using its fur and hide as insulation and its body heat as a heater. It is grotesque, but it is efficient. You are essentially using the corpse of your enemy as a sleeping bag. Now, let us talk about the most important factor: time. Without fire, your ancestors spent almost all of their waking hours doing one thing: finding food. Foraging, scavenging, hunting, processing. There was no leisure time. No sitting around a campfire telling stories. Every moment was a calculation of risk and reward. But this constant pressure is what drove human evolution. It forced them to innovate. They invented the hand axe, the first standardized tool. They invented the spear, the first long-range weapon. They invented the container. Without fire to preserve food, they needed baskets and pouches to carry it. They used animal bladders, tree bark, and woven grasses to create the first backpacks. And all of this happened before fire was controlled. So, when did fire finally appear? The earliest evidence of controlled fire use is around 1.5 million years ago at sites in Africa. But it was sporadic. It was not until about 400,000 years ago that fire became a regular part of human life. And even then, it was not universal. Some groups of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens lived without fire for thousands of years after other groups had mastered it. Why? Because fire is hard to make. Making fire from scratch is one of the most difficult skills a human can learn. It requires the right materials, the right technique, and a lot of practice. For most of human history, people did not make fire. They stole it. They would carry burning embers from one camp to another, or they would wait for lightning strikes or volcanic eruptions. Fire was a gift, not a tool. And when they had it, they guarded it fiercely. A group that lost its fire in the winter could die. So, how did they keep it alive? They used fire logs, slow-burning pieces of wood that could smolder for days. They would wrap these embers in clay or green leaves to keep them from burning out. They would carry them on long journeys, like a living flame. It is a fragile, desperate way to live. But once they had fire, everything changed. They could cook food, which unlocked more calories. They could see at night, which extended their day. They could scare away predators, which allowed them to sleep safely on the ground. They could smoke meat, which allowed them to store food for winter. Fire was the first technology that truly freed humans from the constraints of nature. But the question is, did they need it to survive? The answer is no. They survived for millions of years without it. They were not waiting for fire to save them. They were already successful, already dominant, already spreading across the planet. Fire just made them unstoppable. So, the next time you flick a lighter or turn on a stove, remember this. You are using a tool that your ancestors lived without for 99% of human history. You are a descendant of survivors who faced the cold, the dark, the predators, and the raw meat, and they conquered it all with nothing but their bodies, their minds, and each other. And that is something worth thinking about the next time you complain about the Wi-Fi going out. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you shiver in a cold room, you will feel a strange kinship with those ancient hands rubbing sticks together in the dark. They did not have fire, but they had something just as powerful, the stubborn refusal to give up. Imagine the first human who accidentally tasted cooked meat, perhaps from a wildfire. The sweetness, the tenderness, the sudden rush of energy must have felt like a revelation. Yet that revelation took hundreds of thousands of years to become routine. For every accidental spark, there were 1,000 cold nights. For every controlled flame, there were generations who watched lightning strike and saw only destruction. They learned slowly, through trial and error, through loss and luck. They carried embers and hollowed horns, wrapped in wet moss, across continents. They guarded those embers like a newborn child because in a way, they were. Fire was not a discovery. It was a slow adoption, a careful negotiation with nature. And before that negotiation, humans were not helpless. They were runners, climbers, scavengers, and hunters. They tracked prey for days, reading footprints in the dust. They dug roots with sharpened sticks, cracking open the earth's pantry. They cracked bones with stones, sucking out the marrow that kept them alive. They stored food in tree hollows, in cold streams, in the frozen ground. They used the sun to dry meat, turning it into jerky that could last for months. They used rivers as refrigerators, burying carcasses in the cold mud. They used the stars to navigate, the moon to hunt by, the wind to mask their scent. Every element was a tool, every season a lesson. When winter came, they did not huddle and wait to die. They moved, following the herds, following the warmth. They built shelters from mammoth bones and animal hides, insulated with snow. They wore layers of fur, stitched together with sinew, waterproofed with fat. They learned to predict weather, reading clouds and bird behavior. They knew which plants were poisonous and which could heal. They passed this knowledge down through stories, songs, and gestures. Without writing, without fire, they built a culture. They painted caves by torchlight, but before torches, they painted by daylight. They carved figurines from ivory, using stone blades. They buried their dead with flowers, with tools, with love. They were not savages waiting for salvation. They were engineers of survival, architects of endurance. And when they finally mastered fire, they did not become human. They were already human. Fire just made their humanity more visible. It allowed them to gather around a single flame and share stories. It allowed them to stay awake longer, to think deeper, to dream bigger. It gave them time, the most precious resource of all. But do not mistake convenience for necessity. Without fire, we still would have built cities. We still would have sailed oceans. We still would have reached the stars. It might have taken longer, but the path was already there. Our ancestors were not held back by the cold. They were propelled by the warmth of their own determination. They were not defeated by the dark. They learned to see in it, to move in it, to thrive in it. They were not broken by predators. They outsmarted them, outran them, and eventually outlasted them. They were not weakened by raw meat. They adapted, their jaws growing stronger, their guts learning to digest. They were not victims of their environment. They were masters of it, even without a single spark. So when you look at a campfire tonight, or a candle, or a gas stove, remember the weight of that flame. It is not just light and heat. It is a symbol of partnership, of a deal struck between humans and nature over 1 million years ago. But the deal was not one-sided. Humans brought patience, intelligence, and community to the table. Nature brought fire, but only after we proved we could handle it. And we proved it by surviving without it. That is the lesson hidden in every ember. You do not need the tool to be powerful. You need to be powerful first, and then the tool becomes an extension of your will. Our ancestors were powerful long before they held a flame. They were powerful in their bodies, in their minds, in their bonds. And that power is still inside you, coded in your DNA, waiting for a cold night to remind you. So the next time you feel weak, remember the ones who came before. They did not have fire, but they had each other. They did not have technology, but they had tenacity. They did not have guarantees, but they had hope. And that was enough. That is always enough. They did not have a word for tomorrow, but they built for it anyway. Every sharpened stone was a promise to the next sunrise. Every carefully carried bone was a lesson passed down without a single syllable. Imagine the silence of those nights. No crackling fire, no glowing hearth. Just the sound of breath and the rustle of fur against fur in the vast, indifferent dark. In that dark, they learned to listen. They learned that fear is a teacher, not a master. The rustle of leaves could mean a predator, or it could mean the wind. They learned to tell the difference, not with eyes, but with instinct honed over generations. Their senses were sharper than any blade we own. They could smell rain coming from miles away. They could hear the heartbeat of a rabbit in the underbrush. They could taste the air for smoke or for rot. And in their hands, they held the weight of survival, literally. Raw meat, tough roots, bitter seeds. They chewed for hours, not for pleasure, but for fuel. Their jaws were stronger than ours, their teeth worn flat from grinding. They did not have pots, but they used stomachs as bags. They did not have refrigerators, but snow and ice were their cold storage. They did not have clocks, but the moon and the stars were their calendars. Every season brought a new test. Winter was not just cold. It was a slow death for the unprepared. But they prepared. They stored fat on their bodies like a savings account. They followed herds, not by chance, but by reading the ground. A broken twig, a trampled flower, a patch of dry dung. These were their maps. They did not have language as we know it, but they had meaning. A grunt could mean danger. A touch could mean trust. A shared glance could mean a plan. And when the cold pressed in, they pressed back. With huddles of bodies, with layers of animal hide, with caves that faced away from the wind. They did not curse the cold. They adapted to it. Their blood thickened in winter. Their metabolism slowed. They slept less, but they slept deeper, conserving every calorie. And in the morning, they rose again. Not because they were strong, but because they had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. And so they thought of alternatives. They thought of ways to crack bones for marrow. They thought of ways to dry meat in the sun. They thought of ways to carry water in hollow gourds. They were inventors without a workshop, scientists without a lab. And they succeeded. Not perfectly, not without loss, but enough. Enough to survive, enough to multiply, enough to dream. Dreams of warmth, of light, of a force that could bend the night. That force came later, but the dream existed first, and the dreamers were the ones who made it real. So when you feel the cold of your own life, the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty, remember that you come from dreamers. You come from people who faced the absolute worst and still chose to stand. They did not have fire, but they had each other. They did not have technology, but they had tenacity. They did not have guarantees, but they had hope. And that was enough. That is always enough. If this story sparked something in you, hit subscribe and join us for the next journey into our shared past.